St. John Bosco had hundreds of mysterious visions sent from God in the form of dreams. These mystical experiences were parables that he was meant to tell to his oratory boys to help them make it to heaven. But I think the whole world should hear St. John Bosco's dreams because they're incredibly beneficial for your spiritual life. So join us for our 3-part series on St. John Bosco's dream, The Life-Saving Raft. You're watching The Miracles and Prophecies of St. John Bosco, a project of America Needs Fatima. I'm your host, Matthew Miller. On Monday evening, on the first day of 1866, Don Bosco narrated the following dream. It seemed that I was not far from a town that looked like Castelnuovo di Asti, but it wasn't. The boys of the Oratory were merrily playing in an immense plain. Suddenly, water encroached upon the edges of that plain, and we realized we were surrounded by a flood which advanced towards us. The swollen Po River had overflowed, and with immense destructive torrents, it was coming right for us. Overcome with terror, we ran for a large isolated mill which had walls as thick as those of a fortress. We and our dear dismayed boys stopped in the courtyard of the mill. But as the waters began to seep into that area too, we were all forced to retreat into the house and move into the upper rooms. From the windows, we could see the extent of the disaster. From the Superga hills to the Alps, where we could usually make out meadows, cultivated fields, and woods and farmsteads, we could no longer see anything but an immense lake. As the water rose, we climbed from one floor to the next till we reached the highest floor. By the time we got to the top, we lost all human hope of saving ourselves. I encouraged all my boys to confidently commend themselves into the hands of God and the arms of our Blessed Mother Mary. But the water had already almost reached the top floor of the mill. Then our fright was universal. We saw no other means of escape until a very large raft in the form of a ship floated near us out of nowhere. Everyone was breathless and wanted to be the first to take refuge in the raft, but no one dared because it couldn't come close enough to the house, being prevented by a wall a little taller than the water level. So we had to walk on a long, narrow tree trunk to board the raft. But this task was difficult because one end of the trunk rested on the raft that rose and fell with the rolling waves. Getting up my courage, I crossed over first. To help the young men move calmly from the mill to the raft, I assigned some clerics in the mill to help the boys leave it, and I had other clerics on the raft side who could help those arriving. After a while, the priests found themselves so tired that they were falling down with exhaustion. To my surprise, I saw that those who stepped in to relieve them met the same fate. Amazed, I too wanted to put myself to the test to see what was happening, and soon I felt so exhausted that I could no longer stand either. Meanwhile, many eager young men, either fearing death or wanting to show off their courage, found a wooden plank long enough and a little wider than the tree trunk, and with that, they made a second bridge to the raft. Then, without waiting for the help from the clerics and priests, they rushed across it, not heeding me when I cried out to them to wait. "Cease, cease, or else you will fall," I shouted. But many lost their balance before they reached the boat. They fell and were swallowed by those murky and putrid waters, never to be seen again. Even their fragile plank sank with those on it. A quarter of our young men fell victim to this attempt. Once I realized that the flood had risen above the dividing wall, I was able to push the raft closer to the mill. At this point, Don Caliero stood with one foot on the mill's window ledge and the other on the raft's edge. He offered a hand to help the remaining young men safely jump into the raft. Even so, not all the young men were saved. A number had ascended to the mill's attics and from there to its roof. There they clustered tightly on the ridge while the flood, which had continued to rise without stopping, was already covering the eaves of the roof. But with the water had also risen the raft. So I shouted to the group, recommending that they pray heartily, be quiet, and go down the roof to the raft together, gripping one another's arms so they wouldn't slip. They obeyed, and as the side of the raft reached the eaves, this group also made it aboard, aided by their companions. Once on the raft, we found baskets holding many loaves of bread. When all were safely in the boat, we were still uncertain of escaping that danger. I took command as captain and said to the young men, "Mary is the star of the sea. She doesn't abandon those who trust in her. Let us all place ourselves under her mantle. She'll rescue us from perils and guide us to a calm harbor." So we allowed the waves to control the raft, which floated excellently and moved away from that place. Propelled by the wind, the rushing waves pushed the raft with such speed that we clutched one another so as not to fall. Having quickly covered a great deal of distance, the boat suddenly stopped and spun round and round with extraordinary speed so that it seemed as if it would sink. But a violent gust of wind pushed it out of this whirlpool. The raft then resumed a more regular course. Meeting occasional currents and the saving breath of wind, it finally stopped near a dry, beautiful, vast bank that seemed to rise like a hill in the middle of that sea. Many young men became enamored when the raft encountered this shore. Saying that the Lord had wisely placed man on land and not on the water, they joyfully exited the boat without asking permission, invited others to follow them, and ascended that bank. Their contentment was brief. The flood waters invaded the shores of that beautiful bank as well. Those unfortunate ones found themselves up to their waists in the water in a short time. They were quickly engulfed by the waves and disappeared. I exclaimed, "It is indeed true that if a man empties his purse into his head, no one can take it away from him. An investment in knowledge always pays the best interest." Meanwhile, the raft was again at the whirlpool's mercy and threatening to sink. I saw my boys pale and panting. "Take courage," I cried to them. "Mary will not abandon us." Together we recited the acts of faith, hope, charity, and contrition, as well as a few Our Fathers, Hail Marys, and the Salve Regina. Then, kneeling and holding hands, we each recited particular prayers. However, several fools were indifferent to the danger, as if nothing had happened. They stood up and moved around, snickering among themselves and mocking their companions' pleas and prayers. The raft came to a sudden halt and spun rapidly, and a furious wind whipped those wretches into the waves. There were 30 of them, and nothing more was seen because the water was so deep and muddy. We sang the Salve Regina, and more than ever, we heartily invoked the protection of the Star of the Sea. After that last episode, calm ensued. But like a big fish, the raft kept moving on without us knowing where it would lead us. On board, we were engaged in a continual rescue effort, doing everything possible to prevent the young men from falling into the waters and to save those who did fall overboard. Some leaned carelessly over the raft's edge and fell into the water. Some boys were shameless and cruel and called others to join them near the raft's edge, where a wave would jostle the raft and throw them overboard. Therefore, the priests prepared strong rods, large lines, and hooks of various kinds to retrieve those that went overboard. Some of the clerics attached the hooks to the rods and distributed them. Others stood in their assigned places with their rods raised, their eyes fixed on the waves, and their ears attentive to any cry for help. When a young man fell, the rods were lowered and the castaway grabbed the line, or else he was hooked by his belt or clothes and was thus rescued. The clerics then watched all around the raft's sides to keep the significant number of boys back from the edge. This, of course, is all a parable that Don Bosco will explain in our later episodes, so please join me on Wednesday for part 2 of the dream. God bless you, and Our Lady keep you.